Welcome. Today, let's talk a little bit about academic essay structure. So, essays are a very flexible form in the real world, as I call it. They can take on many different shapes and forms. But if you're writing an academic essay for high school or college, or even as a professional working in a field where you have to publish academically, professionally, there are some expectations about what your essay structure should look like. And note, they are not rules, but they are conventions, agreed upon rules that readers and writers share so that it is easier to communicate. So first of all, essay comes from the French word essayer, and I am 99% sure I am mispronouncing that, which means an attempt. So essay writing is always to be viewed as an attempt at doing something, and in the academic field, what you're attempting to do is show the knowledge that you have learned or are learning, and sharing that with primarily instructors who are going to give you a grade, but also sometimes, they tell you to take your peers into consideration, have your peers as audience. Sometimes they'll tell you to write as if you're writing to a professionals in the field. Sometimes they'll say have a general audience in mind. So essays are really very flexible, but there are some common conventions that the expectation is that people generally follow these, and that if you don't want to follow these conventions, you have to have either a really good reason for not following them. Like, for example, if your instructor told you differently, always do what your instructor tells you to do, right? They're the ones that are giving you the grade. But also, if you have a better way of doing something, you could consider breaking one of these conventions in order to do it the better way, but then you do risk confusion or disagreement from your reader. All right, so let's talk about some of these conventions. So the academic essay structure, this goes back to Aristotle, 500 BCE, the idea that you have three parts in really anything, but also applies to essays, that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in academic essay writing, we call them the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. And they should always be in that order. If you get the opportunity to write a personal essay or something with more flexibility, you can decide to change things up. But most academic essays, normal writing at the college level, would have an introduction first because that's what your reader is expecting, then your body, where you make all of your main points with your body paragraphs, and then your conclusion. So the introduction does primarily three things. First, it should grab the reader's attention, and there's lots of advice, many different places you can find on how to do this. You could ask a question, should not be a yes-no question, and generally shouldn't be a rhetorical question. But make sure that you address that question somewhere in your paper if you're going to ask it. You can tell an anecdote, which is a story or an example of something. It doesn't have to be yours, it can be someone else's, but it's not research. It would be, here's one example that happened one time. So that's why we call it an anecdote. State an interesting fact to try to grab your reader's attention. You can quote someone. Again, try to have the quote be somehow relevant to your topic, so it's not completely in left field and unrelated. Or you could try defining a term or a concept. These are all ways to try to pique your reader's attention and keep them reading. The next thing you want to do in the introduction is introduce and narrow the scope of your topic for the entire paper. So in part one, grabbing the reader's attention, it may or may not be obvious what the topic of your paper even is. So you want to make sure it's clear what the topic of your paper is and that you're narrowing the focus. So for example, if you're writing a paper on higher education, you can't just be like, higher education, period. Because that is such a big topic. There are books and series of books written on that. So you need to narrow the scope. What are you actually going to be focusing on? So for example, I at one point in time wrote an essay about how MOOCs, massive open online courses, wouldn't really impact higher education that significantly. And so my introduction, I had to introduce what a MOOC was because most people did not know that a MOOC was a massive open online course. What they try to do with those things, with online education. So definitely there was some information that needed to be provided about what is this, so that people would know right away what my topic was, and that I was only going to focus on MOOCs and their potential impact on higher education. Then, after you've introduced your topic and made sure that you've narrowed the scope to what you're actually going to focus on, you end with your thesis statement. And that should be the last sentence of your introduction. Ideally, it should be one sentence in length, period. Honestly, if you have to have two, I sometimes let people have two-sentence thesis statements, but really what's happening there is they're still narrowing the scope of their topic, and it's mixing in with them making their thesis statement. So I try to get people to separate those and have a one-sentence thesis statement. And what that shows is that you can summarize the overall focus of your entire paper in one sentence. And that shows that you have complete control of your topic and your focus. So that's why the expectation is a one-sentence thesis statement. It's usually the last sentence of the introduction because it feeds into the rest of your essay. So then you don't need a transition to get into your first body paragraph, because your first body paragraph will be your first point that you are making to support and develop that thesis statement. And that thesis statement should match the purpose of the paper. So if you are writing an informative paper where you're just saying, here's information on this topic, you cannot make an argument, pick a side, or take a stance. You just say, here's information. If you're writing an argumentative paper, your thesis statement is your argument summarized in one sentence. So you have to make sure it's clear what your argument is and a very high-level reasoning for why. And my trick that I always encourage people to try is to copy and paste your thesis statement out of your essay at some point during your revision process and see if it actually can stand on its own, completely alone, and make sense. So in a blank Word document, does this one-sentence thesis statement provide your reader with enough information that they know what your topic is, they know what type of paper you're writing, informative, persuasive, research, etc., and they know a high-level summary of what you're going to focus on. If they can get all that from your one-sentence thesis statement, great. If they can't, you should edit and revise your thesis statement to try to hit on all of those so that it can operate on its own outside of the paper. And for those of you who are visual thinkers, the introduction should look like a funnel where you're starting at your broadest at the top, just grabbing the reader's attention, then introducing the topic, narrowing the topic, and ending with the narrowest point, which is the one-sentence overview of your entire paper, the thesis statement. So it's a funnel or an inverted triangle for visual people. Then you move on to the body of the paragraph, or of the essay, and normally there's a rule of thumb that people follow as far as how many paragraphs do you have to have a true essay. And again, it's a rule of thumb, it's not like a hard rule, but for most people the rule of thumb is 3 body paragraphs. So you have to have an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion, which would ultimately add up to 5 paragraphs. And that's where we get the 5-paragraph essay when you're in middle school and high school, is that's kind of like the minimum of what people consider an essay. And I always encourage people to have more paragraphs than that, especially if you're writing over a 1,000 word or 3-page essay. You are really expected to have more body paragraphs than that, multiple points, more points to help develop and support your topic. And also, if you don't have more body paragraphs, if you limit yourself to 3 body paragraphs for a 10-page paper, you would have 2+ page long paragraphs, which would be way too long for most readers to be able to stick with you and stay on track with what they're reading. And for most writers, those paragraphs would be too long to stay on the same topic and not have any tangents. You know, there are exceptions, of course. So we're looking for at least 3 body paragraphs in your body section, and the expectation is that they have topic sentences. So each one has to have a topic sentence or a main point for one sentence. And if you're really good, you could have an implied topic sentence, which means that it's not obvious that it is the topic sentence, but it's functioning that way. And then you should have at least 2 supporting detail sentences so that you are supporting the topic sentence, the point that you're trying to make. So for most people, they say a paragraph has to have a minimum of 3 sentences. Again, rule of thumb for academic writing. But in reality, for an essay, an academic essay, you should be looking to have paragraphs that are like 5 to 8 sentences, 10 sentences, kind of like max. And again, that's because if you have at least 5 sentences, you're probably going to be developing and supporting that point enough. If you have more than 10 sentences, what happens is people tend to start a new point within that paragraph, which you should never do, right? 1 main point per paragraph. Or they go on a tangent, so they include information that is off topic or not necessary to their paragraph. Or sometimes they get repetitive and they just keep repeating themselves sentence after sentence after sentence. So that's why the encouraged rule of thumb for most people is minimum of 5 sentences, maximum of 10 sentences for body paragraphs in an academic essay. But of course, whatever your instructor says goes. So if they give you a specific range that you need to stay between, you should make sure that you follow that range. And then body paragraphs also need to use transitions within paragraphs and between paragraphs where needed so that your reader can follow your information. They don't feel like it's jumpy or choppy. And also you can maintain the flow of your writing. So transitions between body paragraphs, I usually encourage people to write a phrase or even a whole sentence of transition between body paragraphs so you can show how point A is related to the next point, point B. And I usually encourage people to put those at the beginning of the following body paragraphs, but there is some flexibility with that. You can put transitions at the end of the previous paragraph to jump into the next one. So again, it's what the writer prefers, what they think would be most useful for their reader. And of course, if you're given specific instructions by your instructor, always follow those. Transitions within body paragraphs. So if you're jumping from one supporting detail to another supporting detail and they're not very closely related, you should use words and phrases to show how those supporting details are related, or to just smooth the flow from the first to the second, etc. If absolutely necessary, you can have a sentence length transition within a body paragraph, but if you're trying to be concise, that's where it can cause problems because you're dedicating a lot of time to transitioning when you could be providing more supporting details to support and develop your topic sentence. And then do be aware that there are organizational patterns available for essay paragraphs and essay bodies of essays. So some of the most common would be emphasis or importance. So you start with your most important information and work to your least important information, or you can start with your least important information and work your way up to the most important information. But I would warn you that readers can leave your essay at any time. So generally you want to start with the most important information so that they don't leave before you get to your most important points. But again, you have flexibility in choosing that. You could do problem solution, where you identify a problem and then you identify a solution or multiple solutions. Advantage versus disadvantage, cause and effect, identify a cause, then go over the effect or multiple effects. You can do subtopics and types, different categories, however you think it best makes sense to you and the reader. Chronological order, most common for historical information and personal stories where it's important that you keep a linear storyline. Otherwise, that's not terribly common for academic writing. Compare and contrast, you can look at every criteria that you're comparing and contrasting for each topic. First half of the essay cover everything about the first thing that you're comparing and contrasting, object A, for example. Then the second half of the paper, compare and contrast everything about object B. Not terribly effective though, because if you forget, your reader forgets what was covered for object A when they're looking at object B, that can be kind of confusing. So it's usually recommended that you break it up by criteria. So you say this is criteria 1 for object A and object B. Here, next paragraph is paragraph 2 for object A and object B, etc., etc. And then lastly, you have your conclusion. And the conclusion is tricky for a lot of people. It's okay, it's tough. The more you do it, the better you will get at it. Same is true with writing thesis statements and papers in general, that the more you do it, the better you'll get. But conclusion is normally a regular triangle shape where you start with your restated thesis statement. So it should be different wording, but you can have 1 to 2 sentences that restates your thesis, and you can actually be more specific and use stronger information and stronger wording in your restated thesis because you have already provided all of your points and details in the body of the essay. Then you switch to summarizing or synthesizing your main points. The easiest to do is to summarize. You just say covered A, B, C, done, right? Synthesis is harder. Synthesis is where you're taking your points, point A, point B, point C, and showing how they work together or don't work together to come to your final conclusion. So summary is like the basic version of that. If you are getting good at writing, you're going to be working on synthesizing your main points. And I generally encourage people, again, rule of thumb from me, is that you should do that in 2 to 4 sentences. Just keep it pretty short so that your conclusion does not itself turn into a whole nother paper. But you do not need 1 sentence per main point. You can summarize and synthesize down smaller than that. And basically, again, tying your ideas and points together to get to your final conclusion, your final takeaway. And then the last thing to do is to find an interesting way to bow out, which is really tough because you don't want to just stop. You don't want to use the words the end. Don't use the words the end or fin or any other similar ways to end something. So instead, a couple of options would be to use the mirror strategy. So however you started your paper, you go back to that. So if you started with a quote, you would end by considering that quote. Don't repeat it, but you continue talking about it, expanding it out, see what it means now in light of all the other information that you provided in the body of your essay. If you started with a fact, you could go back to that fact and see again, what does it mean now with your all of the information in your paper and your final takeaway. You could also do the so what question. So don't actually write so what, but in your mind think so what? So what does this matter? What does this mean to people? And try to answer that with your last sentence or so. The other option is to consider future social or personal implications for this. So you've got this information provided throughout your essay. So what does that mean for the future? What does that mean for society? What does that mean for people? And those are just some ways to try to bow out of the essay in an interesting way, because you don't want to say, this is it, this is the end, don't think about this anymore. You actually are trying to start a dialogue with people through essays. So you want them to consider, keep thinking about things, consider your parting information, rather than saying, that's it, that's the end, all good to go. All right, so that is the basic essay structure. And for you visual people, again, inverted triangle or funnel into roughly a square shape, because all body paragraphs will be roughly the same level of detail that you get into. And then a triangle where you, again, start very specific and broaden out as the conclusion.